Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. This afternoon, I will be reading chapter 29, which will probably be presented in two parts, although I may have to break it into three. We will see. Wysteria, chapter 29. As they hiked through the forest toward the town, Will explained to Emily what had happened in the valley, what the water goddess had said, and the effect of her words. She'd helped him break free, but not with a push. She'd given him guidance. She had shown him the way. And now, Emily asked him. Now, he said. Do you think you'll be able to move into the dark and travel without her help? She said. Will thought for a moment. Yes, he answered. Without my help? She asked. That was a good question. I think I could get into the dark, he replied. Good, said Emily. But could I find my way out? He continued. I don't know. Once they emerged from the woods and entered the southern edge of the garden, Will slowed his pace. We should move cautiously now, he said. We're getting close. Has the signal gotten any clearer? She asked. It's still fuzzy, still jumping around, he told her. It's definitely centered in the square, though. But no bells, Emily observed, referring to the alarm raised during the first drifter incursion. No, he said, no bells. Isn't that a good sign? He paused before answering, then shook his head. Unfortunately, I don't think so. When the stairway that led up to the main gate came into view, Will suddenly stopped, for he now felt another presence, distinct and unconnected to the cacophony of vibrations emanating from within the walls of the town. Someone else is here, he said in a hushed voice. Here, in the garden. Emily moved closer to him. Friend or foe, she whispered. Will stared ahead, trying to focus attention on this new signal. I think, he murmured. Then, leaving his thought hanging, he began to walk forward, while Emily followed behind. After taking a dozen measured steps, Will halted. There, he said, looking toward the top of the stairs, where a lone figure sat on one of the stone benches on the upper terrace. It's a woman, said Emily. Do you know who she is? Have you seen her before? Yes, he answered. She's the elusive blonde woman. Emily looked perplexed. Is she part of this? She's not one of them, said Will, who was now certain that multiple troublemakers lurked in his town. And yet, it's no coincidence that she's here now, waiting. Waiting for what? Emily asked him. For me. What are you going to do? She said. Are you sure you can trust her? Will hesitated, weighing the possible risks. She's always steered me in the right direction, he replied. So we'll see what she has to say. They left the cover of the trees and moved toward the stairway. The woman appeared to notice their approach, but even as they reached the bottom of the steps and began to climb them, she remained sitting, making no move to leave or greet the couple. It was not until they descended the stairs and stepped onto the terrace that she stood and faced them. "My lord," she said, lowering her eyes as she lifted the hem of her full skirt and curtsied. She then looked at Emily, studying her for a moment before smiling politely. "My lady." "Good afternoon," said Will. "Yes, perhaps," the woman replied. "We will see." "Enjoying the view?" he asked. It was an innocent enough question, one that gave her the chance to volunteer an explanation for her presence here. "It is a wonderful view," she said, a faint, melancholy smile forming on her lips as she looked out across the garden. "However, sad to say, that is not why I am here. There are strangers in the town." "Yes, I heard," he said. "Have they caused any trouble?" "No, not as yet." "Good. I was just on my way to deal with them." "Of course," she said. "But be warned. These are dangerous men, and you must handle this situation with great care." "But they are just men," said Will, concerned that he might be facing another species of foe. "Not something else?" He quickly realized that it must sound like an odd question. "They are men," she answered, unfazed. "But some of them are not ordinary men, and there are many of them." "How many?" he inquired. "By my count, no less than a dozen." "I see." That was more than Will would have expected, but it explained the source of why the source of the intrusion was so difficult to pin down. "Now," he continued, "when you say they're not ordinary men—" "You should be on your guard," said the woman. "That is all I can tell you." Was that all she knew, or only what she was willing to say? "Do you happen to know why they're here?" Will asked her. She glanced at Emily and replied somewhat cryptically, "You understand their intentions as well as I do." Then, as if anticipating his next question, she continued, "It is not for me to advise a course of action. This is your realm. I am simply delivering information." At this, having discharged her duty, their lovely messenger bowed her head and turned to exit the garden. "One last question," said Will, stopping her. "May I ask who you are?" She hesitated for a moment, but then faced him and smiled. "My name is Iris," she said, offering a parting nod before passing through the open doorway into the street. Will walked across the terrace and stood just inside the exit. "Now that you've met the blonde woman, what do you think of her?" he asked Emily, while he watched the woman they now knew as Iris stroll up the street toward the plaza. "Well, she certainly seems sincere, if that's what you mean," she replied, joining Will at the gate. "Do you doubt what she told you?" "No," he said. "I trust her. But who is she?" "I don't have a clue," said Emily. There was the usual amount of foot traffic on the street today, perhaps a bit more. On the surface, everything seemed as it should be. Then, Will noticed a man standing atop the wall above the entrance to the square, half hidden behind the battlements, peering down the road in their direction. And though he looked like an ordinary citizen, Will knew he was not. "I see one of them," he said. "Where?" she asked. "Above the gate. He must be a lookout." "I guess we can't sneak in the front door," said Emily. Will considered leaving the garden through a side exit and trying another entrance into the plaza, but he assumed the other gates were being watched as well. If Emily weren't with him, he would have been tempted to march down the middle of the street and confront his enemies head on. With her there, however, a frontal attack was out of the question. "Couldn't you somehow disable him?" she asked. "Send an iron kettle his way," he said, chuckling. "I have a feeling the others would notice that. We'd have one less to deal with, but we'd lose the element of surprise." And Will wanted to hold on to that advantage for as long as he could, at least until he had a clearer idea of what they'd be facing. "I'd like to get to that secret room in the wall and have a look inside the square," he told her. But that would mean moving into the street, and dressed as they were, he and Emily would easily stand out among the other pedestrians. As Will began considering other options, he saw Iris suddenly stop. She stood still for a moment, then spun around, catching his stare and returning a smile. Will shot a quick glance at the man standing guard above the gate, fearing he might have noticed their exchange. But though the sentry carefully studied each citizen who approached the entrance, he seemed oblivious to the beautiful young woman standing in the middle of the street directly in front of him. "What is she doing?" Emily whispered. "I have no idea," he said. As Iris turned away and resumed her advance toward the gate, Will noticed a faint halo of multicolored light hovering around her body. Assuming his eyes were responsible for the effect, he blinked several times, trying to clear his vision. Whatever its cause, the aura soon faded. But there was now a subtle yet unmistakable difference in the way she carried herself. Her bearing was stately, almost regal. The stranger above the gateway suddenly locked his eyes on her. Iris paused, glanced up at him, and bowed her head. He smiled and nodded in return. As she continued forward, the man leaned over the edge of the wall and watched her pass through the gate beneath him. He then turned and stepped to the other side of the wall, where he waited for her to emerge into the square. With the lookout's attention now riveted on Iris, Will saw his opportunity. "Let's go," he said, grasping Emily's hand and pulling her through the doorway. They moved forward quickly, hugging the buildings along the right side of the road, while Will kept a watchful eye on the sentry, who still had his back turned to them. Unseen, as far as they knew, they made it to the doorway that led to the back alleyway. Opening the door and seeing the hallway was empty, Will ushered Emily inside. "Thank you, Iris," he said, after closing the door behind him. "For a moment, I was worried she had jumped sides and was planning to give us away," said Emily. "But she distracted him for us, didn't she?" "Yes," he said with a smile. It appears so. But how did she know? She asked. I mean, you didn't tell her that we wanted to get into the secret room. It was a good point. He'd said nothing about the idea until after Iris had left them. And she certainly couldn't have heard him when he mentioned it to Emily, for she was halfway up the street and well out of earshot. Maybe she just assumed we needed to get out of the garden without that man spotting us, he said, offering her, as well as himself, a reasonable explanation. In his heart, however, he felt there was more to it than that. I suppose, she said, sounding unconvinced. Will started to ask whether she, too, had seen the change in Iris's appearance, but he stopped himself. This wasn't the time to discuss it. He had to stay focused on their current mission. They passed down the hall and through the back door into the narrow alley. Will quickly scanned the tops of the surrounding buildings, making sure there were no eyes spying on them from above. Then they made for the arched door at the upper end of the lane. Pulling aside some of the vines, which had already begun to obscure the entrance, he pushed the door open and cautiously looked inside. All clear, he announced, motioning for Emily to follow as he entered the dim space. Once inside, Will leaned on the heavy door, pushing it shut, then led the way up the stairs to the room above. And that concludes part 1, and we'll return right away with the conclusion of the chapter.